Morning, Ian. Glad to be here with you and all those who are listening.
I agree, and I think we've gone from Neanderthal to Cro-Magnon when it comes to all this technology stuff. So this is a big upgrade for us.
Absolutely.
All right, well, I'll begin by introducing myself as I always do. My name's Ian Kinder. I'm the owner and founder of a school called Live Safe Academy, and we're a safety and self-defense school. So we specialize in the training of first aid, assault and crime prevention, unarmed self-defense, the use of chemical defense sprays, sharp weapons, impact weapons, tasers, and firearms. If you'd like to learn more about our school, please visit us online at livesafeacademy.com. And I'm interviewing today Lou Chiodo. And if you'd like to know more about his extensive background, you can listen to our podcast #1 on target focused shooting. Though, of course, Lou will talk a bit about his background in this Google Hangout also. But the purpose of this Hangout is a companion podcast or a companion production to our podcast #3 on integrated training. And what we mean by that is the integrated use of different force methods. So depending on the circumstances that we're in, we might have to integrate the use of unarmed combat skills with firearm skills. The full spectrum of force we have to be prepared to deploy as necessary. And the purpose of these Hangouts is kind of like a after podcast show. So we're going to talk about the things that we talked about in the podcast, but this is not an exact duplicate of the podcast. So you'll benefit either by just watching this Hangout or by listening to the podcast or by using both together to complement one another. And Lou, let me bring you into this, and thank you very much for being here. And if you can, talk a little bit about your background and then define for us what do you mean when you say integrated training methods or the integrated use of force.
Well, good morning again, Ian. Well, my background in discussing these issues comes from several different sources. One, I'm reaching my 50th anniversary here in martial arts. This gave me a background on not only methodologies, but also how to teach those methodologies, how to try to integrate those methodologies with the other things that I've done via my training background. I went from a martial arts background into a military background as a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps. What was kind of neat about that experience in relation to the topic that we're going to talk about of integrated training is that became a very critical part of training, was integrating the various things that we were being trained in. We don't do things in a vacuum, meaning that we get trained in certain skills, but at some point those skills have to come together. We spent a lot of time developing that type of training and actually doing that sort of training. I then went into a law enforcement background when I separated from the Marine Corps, and there it was much the same as far as we have a need to train in very real things to do because we're dealing with very real problems. And this gave me an opportunity to not only apply the training that I did prior to getting into law enforcement, but also over a number of years develop programs and develop the ways of integrating all of these skill levels into a program of instruction that someone could go through and actually learn how to integrate all of these skills. Then, of course, I started my own business with Gunfighters Limited, in which then I took the things that I developed and actually go out into the civilian world with the concealed carry individuals, and of course with you and things that you have hosted to bring some of those training methods out to the public.
Well, one of the biggest things that impressed me about your background is the fact that you never left the field. All the time that you were involved in training, you were working in the field with the very people that you were training, so that you're getting direct feedback on how that training was working, how it was actually being applied to real world circumstances. And I think that's a really big deal, to have that honest feedback, to really keep your feet on the ground and understand the difference between what training makes a difference and what training just doesn't translate into real application. May look good in the classroom, may look good on the range, but doesn't make a difference in real circumstances. And just kind of talk a little bit about this Hangout format. For those who don't know, you do have the ability, if you're watching live, to ask questions. Lou, we've had several people post questions for us that we'll answer at the end of this Hangout. But what's kind of neat is anybody who's listened to the podcast, or anybody who's watching this Hangout, or anybody who's trained with either me or you, they now have an opportunity to, in real time, ask those questions and have us answer them live. And for those of you that can't stay for the entire broadcast, we'll be here for about an hour. You can still leave your questions, and then you can come back and watch those answers later. And that's kind of neat to have this interactive, this technology where we can give people real-time answers. But let's talk a little bit more about, like, you know, as an example, one of my instructors in our podcast series, I interviewed him in one of the later podcasts that'll come out on an altercation that he got into in a city called Pontiac, which borders Detroit, Michigan here, which is where I'm located. And he got into a situation where he was working for Swans at the time, and somebody reached out for him, and he saw this out of the corner of his eye. He drew his head back quickly as a person was reaching for his head. He smashed his hand into the truck that he was pulling food products out of. The guy yelped. He dropped something. He quickly moved back. He immediately went to hit the guy. He caught him, but just barely because he's moving away so quickly. Then another guy comes at him. He grabs his gun. They both see the gun, and they run away. Now, and we found out later, by the way, or he found out later after they had run away, that was actually a box cutter in the guy's hand, and he was reaching for his throat. So there was a situation that even though he was armed with a gun, there's a very real possibility that if that gun was the only solution that he had, he could end up dead with that gun still in the holster, because there simply wasn't time for his immediate response to be that gun. There wasn't time to get that gun from that holster and on the target. His immediate response had to be his body and his mind. And I always tell students that even if you carry a weapon, your body and your mind are the only two things that you take with you wherever you go, and they're the quickest things that you can deploy. So it's not just enough to say that I carry a weapon and I'm safe. No, we have to have a full spectrum of force methods, because the circumstances that we're in may require something different than that weapon. Even if that weapon is ultimately the solution, we still may not be able to get to it quick enough to be the first initial response.
Well, I couldn't agree with that more. What we're getting at here is that it's never enough to just say that you have a firearm on your person, that is going to be the solution to all the problems that you get into in a tactical scenario. And it's very important to have other skills that you may have to rely on in order to get you to that firearm at some point in the confrontation. And this brings us to the issue of, well, one, why do we do integrated training, and really what is integrated training? So if I could answer those two questions pretty quick here. One, the what is integrated training evolves around the concept that we have many different skills that we may have to rely upon in a physical confrontation. We may have tools on us that we have immediately available, such as our personal weapons, meaning our hands, our feet, our knees, our elbows, all the things that we would fight in a, quote, hand-to-hand type of combative scenario. But at the same time, we may have a knife in our possession. We may have our firearm. We may have weapons of opportunity that are near us that we can immediately translate into weapons to defend ourselves. So we need to have some way of putting all of this together so that an individual, when confronted with a particular scenario, has the immediate ability to fall back on several skill sets to be able to come up with a solution to keep them safe. So the bottom line to why do we integrate training goes back to an example of what you just tried to put forth. And that is that we may at any given point in time in a particular confrontation have to rely on a tool that might not be the best for the scenario, but it may be the only thing that's immediately available that could possibly open up a window for us to use our other tools that we have available.
Can you give us some examples of how this might come out in law enforcement training and how that might apply to the public? So as an example, a lot of times officers may end up with a physical fight with somebody, and then suddenly that threat becomes deadly, and now they have to quickly transition to the use of their firearms. Lou, the reason why I'm asking this is because a lot of gun people will say, well, I don't need to fight, I carry a gun. I carry a gun so I don't have to fight. And of course, that's an unrealistic perspective. One of the reasons why they have this opinion is they'll say, well, you don't let them get that close. Well, in the real world, people are close to you all the time. And criminals aren't going to wait to reveal their intentions until they're 21 feet away. They're going to wait to reveal their intentions until they're right on top of you. And until they do reveal their intentions, they're no different than all those other strangers that we walk by. So the reality is, even though we always want to position ourselves in our environment so we're less likely to get caught off guard and we have more time to respond, no matter how hard we try, we're always going to be by strangers. We're always going to be by blind spots. And the reality is attacks usually happen close. We need a very quick way to respond, usually when we're getting caught off guard. And that initial response is what may buy us time to a more effective response. So what are some examples you can draw from in law enforcement, and how would those apply to the public?
Okay, well, it boils down to a very simple concept. That is that when we look at the way people attack us, the vast majority are spontaneous in nature to us, because if we had a forewarning that someone was going to attack, that would open up a door for us to be able to respond in a much different way. The other concept of this that I think is very critical for everybody that is training to defend themselves is to understand that a lot of these attacks on us are virtually ambushes. Now, as a person is going to pick the time and place, pick the time when you're the most vulnerable, is going to use any means that they can get to be able to get close to you, to be able to spring their attack so that it works to their advantage and your disadvantage. As an example, if we're looking at a law enforcement environment, well, the vast majority of contacts that are made are within what we would call conversational distances. When we're doing interviews in the field, when you're dealing with someone for whatever type of incident, we're not on a megaphone and they're not 25 yards away from us, and we're not talking to them in that manner. Even though we can have a what would be considered to be a safe space cushion between us and them, that can rapidly disintegrate within a matter of about a half to 3/4 of a second, just based on their initial movement. And then when we add in all these other factors of your ability to see what is going on, the observe part of the odor cycle, orient on what the person is doing, meaning, is it a physical attack on me? Is it an edge weapon attack? Are they drawing a gun as they are advancing towards me? We have to be able to orient on what type of a attack it is, so that we know what type of an appropriate response is available to us. Then we have to make a decision about how we're going to deal with it, and then we're going to have to act, and actually, whatever plan of defense we have, it actually has to now take form, and it actually has to start working, or else we start losing. So when we look at the totality of it, in a law enforcement environment, even though you bring up this point of, most people say they're just not going to let them get that close. Well, sorry, but that's the essence of the way that you work. There's just no way of getting around that. And for the civilian population, it could be even worse, because your attacker doesn't view you as though you're an officer, meaning you're not in uniform, you're not bringing that authority to whatever's going on there. What you are to them is a victim waiting to be victimized. So if, for example, someone is going to have a gun threat against you, they're probably not going to initiate this from 15, 20 yards away. They're going to still come into a very close-quartered environment with you, and then take you at gunpoint or begin shooting at you, whatever they intend to do. If someone intends to use an edge weapon as the means of attack on you, well, it's only common sense. You can't hurt people with a knife unless you get within range to be able to hurt them with it. So that doesn't mean they're going to draw their knife out when they're 10 yards away from you and start walking towards you. The probability is you're not going to know that you're under attack until you feel the edge of that blade touch some part of your body, or maybe just that quick moment before they actually launch the attack, you may get some indications. the point is they can still, even if you're yelling at them, even if you're telling them to stop, all these things that people naturally do, they're still within a range where one step and the blade's on you. So the bottom line is that just trying to use this, excuse of, well, I'm never going to let them get that close. That's fatalistic thinking. That's thinking about scenarios that really aren't going to happen. And if you're planning for that to happen, you've already started the process of losing that fight.
You know, and I always tell students that anytime you're in a violent situation, there's always going to be circumstances beyond your control, or you wouldn't be in that violent situation. So you can't just, try to plan to win fights the way that you want to win those fights. You really have to have the ability to adapt to whatever circumstances are most probable. So it's good to do our due diligence and try to avoid these situations in the first place, and that's always the most important aspect of being safe, is the prevention. But we also have to know that no amount of prevention is going to make us crime-proof. We have to have a way to respond if bad things happen, and we have to have a way to respond to the situations that are most likely to happen. And I think that's where the skill integration is so important. And this is also particularly true because just to isolate sharp weapons, looking at statistics and having in fact talked with many people that I know that have been victims of sharp weapons assaults, they never knew that they were being assaulted with a sharp weapon until the assault was already well in progress, or in many cases until the assault was over. So in other words, they thought that they were getting physically hit, as in punched as an example, but they didn't realize until later that no, they weren't getting punched, they were getting stabbed. So somebody may very well find themselves in a physical altercation where they think it's, for lack of a better term, a fist fight, and at some point in that altercation realize, I'm not getting hit, I'm getting stabbed. Well, now what? Well, now you have to make that very quick transition to deal with that lethal threat, whether that be to draw your gun or to immediately try to secure that weapon or whatever the response is. The point is you have to change your game plan. So can we talk a little bit about how would somebody, if they say, okay, you sold me, I get it, the integrated training is very important, I can't just walk around with that hammer and think that every problem is a nail, I've got to have more than one solution to bring to bear because there's more than one type of problem that I might have to solve, now what? So they say, I just want to take all these skills and I want to train to throw them in the mixing bowl. How do they take this knowledge and apply it?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that's going to be the basis of our total conversation of this morning's session. We have to look at this as a problem that can be solved by taking each of the components of self-defense and then having to blend them together in a meaningful way so that as you're training for one particular type of defense, such as using your personal weapons, your hand-to-hand, if you will, type of responses, that it somehow is going to be able to link with or integrate with other things that you might do. So we start off by saying that we're going to compartmentalize several different skill sets that have to be done or trained in order to put it all together at some point in time and make it meaningful. So whether we start with firearms, whether you start with unarmed skill sets, whether you start with knife integration into your training, all of these things are going to be separate components that must be trained so that ultimately whatever ones you have available with you, because some people may just have one or two things with them at any given time, that we can at a later point take those skill sets and blend them together in a meaningful way so that they've actually learned how to apply them in an environment that is going to be consistent with reality. So think of this as a total system that is going to be comprised of separate parts that have to be trained separately and then ultimately put together.
So they have to develop their skills in isolation. So as an example, if I was going to train students and I was going to start them on unarmed combat skills, we'd start with platform. We talk about the body mechanics of using your body weight to generate force. And then we talk about the proper execution of the individual strikes that they learn. That would be one aspect of training. And then if it was gun training, again, we'd start with fighting platform. We talk about grip. We talk about aiming. They develop that in isolation. Sharp weapons, impact weapons, the same protocol. And then once they have those skills developed as individual skills, that now opens a door for them to take those skills and train them together so that they can use them in an integrated response. So first in isolation as the first step to bringing them together so that they can be integrated.
Exactly. And let's talk a little bit about this individual training, or each component. One of the tenets that I have in the classes that I teach is that our goal is to perfect simplicity. And what we mean by that is that all the training that we do in any of these skill sets, it doesn't matter whether we're talking unarmed combat, whether you're talking firearms, and in firearms, whether you're speaking about use of shotguns, rifles, handguns, any of the things that we're training, our goal is to take very simple principles and train them to the point of perfection, and then at that point be able to integrate them. The problem that we have in a lot of the things that people train is that they're taking complex things in and of themselves. For example, if it's just unarmed combat, and I think this goes to a lot of the quote martial art type things that we see that people traditionally go to try to learn how to defend themselves. While there's baseline things there that can be exceedingly useful during live real fights, many of the things are really not going to work because they're very complex to do. And many people don't have the time or the ability to spend that kind of time to take very complex things and make them usable in a real world environment. So what we have to do is, when we're doing this individual component training of individual skill sets, is completely rely on simple things that we can learn in a very short time, that we can have as a means of getting around the motor skill problems that we see when we're put on the high stress, and have these skills be more gross motor skill, as opposed to being a skill set that requires very complex motor skills to be used, a, a multitude of different steps in the process to be able to allow something to actually work. The real world just doesn't allow for that to happen. And for most people in the time-strapped environment that we all live in, we just simply don't have that kind of time to spend to take complex things and bring them to the point of being usable in real-world encounters. So we want to eliminate complex things in our training, and the common theme to all of this process is to then take the simple things that we learn to perfection and then use those things to be brought into that world of integration that we're going to be talking about.
So the idea here is then that we need skills that are natural, normal. We need skills that are common movements that we apply all the time. And we need skills that are based on the body's natural responses to stress, like gross motor skills, as an example. And, we stress a lot the simplicity as well. And I think this is a real key concept. We want fewer ways of doing more things. So as an example, our fighting platform for shooting a gun or for unarmed combat or for using an impact weapon, sharp weapon, chemical spray, taser, doesn't matter. It's all the same platform. And that's really important because under stress, people aren't going to say, okay, well, when I shoot I do it this way. When I'm unarmed combat, I do it this way. When it's a sharp weapon, I do it that way. The brain's just not going to function on that level. So we want as few ways as possible to do the broader spectrum of things that we have to get done, reducing the need for our brain to have to sort out, if I'm doing this, then I have to do it this way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And and you talked about platform, and I want to just spend a couple of seconds talking about that. And here's where we start to really see a lot of problems of integrating training, because traditionally what happens is when people go look to develop skill sets in different things such as unarmed combat or the use of knives, use of sticks, use of their firearms, they may be getting this information from a multitude of sources. And while it's nice to get a lot of different ideas, and there's no problem with seeing how things are done in different ways. The problem we have with it is that when we start to get information that conflicts, meaning we're being taught to do a particular platform when we're using unarmed combat. Then you go to the range and you're being taught to use a platform with your firearms that is different than what you may use with your unarmed combat. And then you go to the guy that's teaching you how to integrate a knife into all of this, and he teaches you a certain way of standing or certain stances. The problem that we start to see when we put this all together is that you've got components that don't quite blend. And the problem we have on the stress is our minds aren't going to be working to be able to synthesize all these various things that we've been trained that are different from each other. So it's very important for those of you listening and trying to get into integrated type training that there's got to be commonality, in philosophy, in the way that you're being taught. There's got to be a common way to integrate your body into all of this, which is, the starting point for that is platform. And as you know, Ian, in a lot of the classes that we've done out with you, that we build off this platform in all the things that we're teaching in the various skill sets that we're trying to develop. And what happens is the individual trying to learn can get to where they go a lot faster because their body's not being trained in several different ways of doing things. So platform has got to be very common to everything that we do. And what we do is we start off with platforms that we know people get into when they're on the high stress and in combat. So we don't like to do bladed stances. We don't like to do things that distribute your weight so that it's more equal, meaning you're not forward, not back. You're just kind of in the center where you really don't have much in the way of utilizing your body weight in order to help you in the fighting process. And we try to base these platforms off of the reality of what happens to people based on things such as sympathetic nervous system, which brings your eyes to focus in the center. When we start to get tunnel vision and our peripheral vision narrows, it tends to turn our body straight on whoever we're fighting. These are all the things that have to be considered when you're developing a platform that you're going to fight from. And the circumstances that bring us to that platform are going to pretty much be exactly the same, regardless of what weapon system we're using in order to defend ourselves. So this is the root of beginning integrated training, is to make sure that what we're doing is going to be consistent along the spectrum of all the different tools that we're going to be training.
So we start off with that simplicity. We want skills that are based on the body's natural responses to stress and common simple movements. We want the fewest way possible to do the broadest spectrum of necessary skills. Now, what would be the next step for somebody? So as an example, now they've got to learn to take those individual physical skills that, hopefully meet all the different criteria that we just talked about. And now they have to start to integrate them together. And I know this is going to deal with a couple different important issues. One is going to be the visual recognition and decision making of when to do what. But the other thing is, just from a mechanical point of view, people have to learn how to seamlessly transition from one skill set to another skill set. So a real basic simple exercise that I would have my students do is hit pads or hit a heavy bag, and then they would quickly transition to drawing their gun, either dry fire with airsoft, so that they're now integrating those unarmed combat skills with those firearms skills, learning how to bridge those two things together. And Lou, if I can say one thing here, I kind of made a joke about our, if people only knew how technologically challenged we were, all this stuff that we're doing is literally a miracle. Like, we learn about this stuff a week before we do it, and then all of a sudden we're staring at the computer like a bunch of Cro-Magnums trying to, figure out how fire works, right? But your lower third right now is not on, and I want people to see your website and your name on there, so I want to know how they can contact you. Can you see how to turn on your lower third real quick? You got that toolbox off to your left, and when you select that toolbox, then it'll give you the option of turning on your lower third. You see it?
I've got the toolbox open. Where do I have to click on the toolbox?
I think if you click on the toolbox, if you just click on it, it'll bring over on your right-hand side, it'll bring over that option where you can select your lower third.
Okay, there's several things I can click on here that I'm not sure which will do that.
The one you want to use is the Hangout toolbox. It's a red. It looks like a toolbox with a little handle on it.
I've got that open. The thing that I need to get to is when I open that, what should I click on?
On the very left on the top, there's like a silhouette with a circle around it.
Got it.
Click on that. And then at the bottom, if you check it off.
Okay.
And there you go. Look at that.
Oh,
see?
boy.
Folks are not just learning how to save their life, they're learning how to run a Hangout. So they're getting kind of like a dual thing here.
Well, this thing doesn't have a trigger on it, so it's kind of hard to figure out.
We're just lucky that that option for the lower third looks like a silhouette target. Because you can see it, right?
See that there.
Yeah.
Well, if I can, let me kind of answer some of the things that you've just brought up. One of them is that no matter where you're starting off, and it's going to be somewhere, whether with unarmed combat, with firearms, at any point where you're developing that skill, we have to make sure that beyond the point of what we talked about of being simple, gross motor skilled techniques and things of that nature, we have to make sure that that individual skill has been trained to the point of being very usable for the individual who is actually going to apply this to further training. In other words, if we try to push too fast through that and the person really doesn't have a grasp on that individual skill set, it would be a mistake to push into any kind of integration. Because then what we've done is we open up a door to say that we're now going to try to combine a couple of things together when the individual isn't really too well briefed or hasn't developed an appropriate level of skill to be able to integrate those two components. So we would encourage everybody that when you start into any given skill set development, to make sure you give it enough time to be able to develop that skill. And it shouldn't take too long, because if it's simple, such as learning palm strikes, learning knee strikes, things of that nature, it doesn't take too long to get people dialed in on that stuff. But make sure you spent enough time to start to get the rhythm of what you do there and understand it, so that you won't have problems that will complicate the integration. So once we have that sorted out, when we start to talk about actual integration, now we're going to be taking at first maybe two of these different skill sets. So let's use something very simple that I think is probably the starting point for most people that would be watching this. That is unarmed skill techniques and your firearms. Why do we say that? Is because, one, a lot of people in different places now can't carry firearms. Where we're seeing a lot of concealed carry, and also having the unarmed combat skill is going to be one of the better gateways, if you will, to get you from maybe repelling a spontaneous attack to get you to that firearm. And if you don't have that unarmed combat skill, you may never get to the firearm before the fight is over. So what we would try to do in that case is, once we have developed the individual skill sets in those two things, is we would just develop very simple drills. And we're not worried at this point about detecting threats and decision-making, that sort of thing. Because what we want to do is get people comfortable with saying, I can go from an unarmed combat skill to getting my firearm out, and do that in a very smooth transition based on where I'm carrying my weapon, and being able to understand at what point in the fight it would be appropriate to either break contact to get to it, because you may not have that opportunity depending on how the fight goes. But initially, we do very simple things. You're doing simple pad drills where people are integrating, let's say, palm strikes to the pad, making very solid, good strikes on it, with good skill development that they've got doing that particular thing. Then at a point give them a signal to transition to their handgun. Now, if we're doing this right, again, to make sure that people don't get kind of left behind, we may not even worry about them doing this initially from a concealed position. We may take them first step in doing it from an open carry, and then start to build concealment into it. Um, and in the process of doing this, they're learning how to go simply from one particular skill to the other in a very smooth way. It's just to developing the mechanical skills that would be needed to be able to accomplish that. To make sure that if it's their firearms, that they've developed the proper way of deploying that from concealment, understanding based on distance that they are when they draw it, what type of a presentation of that weapon is going to be appropriate, meaning is it something I can come up to eye level with? Is it something that I'm going to be in more of a close quartered position? Or is it something where, because of the extreme distances, meaning being very close to the individual, I may have to shoot from an extremely close quartered position? And these are all things that you're going to learn in the individual skill development. But then here's now a way of us to start to put it together for you to understand how it all starts to blend, so that you have a better way of understanding where you might need more work on things. You may have to work more on your, let's say, getting your weapon from the concealed position to deploying it in a more smooth manner. You may have to adjust your gear because it's maybe not working from the position that you are carrying that weapon. These are all the things that we start to work with as you're doing this type of integration of training. And so this is kind of like the walk, the crawl, walk, run type thing. We need to, start to do things very slowly and then start to build up speed in it. And then once we can get these two skills developed, then if there are other skill sets that we've been working on, then we would, in a very similar manner, start to integrate those skills in prescribed drills in order to get people to really understand how and where they can utilize these skills in putting them together.
It's funny because I do quite a few private lessons throughout the week, and I had just one private lesson not too long ago where the individual was perfectly competent in individual skills. In other words, if I had to do unarmed combat or certain defensive skills that we teach, or firearm skills that we teach, all of those things are fine in isolation. But when I start to take those things and put them in an integrated way, particularly if he's having to visually respond to what he sees, so now that's the next step of this conversation would be training the eyes. But now all of a sudden I noticed when we were working with airsoft as an example, he was starting to falter on his accuracy. So now we got to bring it back. We got to focus now on that particular aspect, and then we had to start to bring the training back up again where he can go full speed in that reactionary way without, not on his time, but where he's reacting to something that he sees and making that judgment, but still retain that accuracy. Now, with traditional training methods, that issue might not have ever been exposed. But with the integrated training, when we're using more of a fluid and dynamic way of practice, that issue immediately comes to the surface. Where it would have come to the surface would have been in a real fight. But with this type of training, we can sort those issues out ahead of time by even recognizing that they're problems in the first place. Again, with traditional training methods, that issue might have never been exposed, but it was immediately exposed in this type of fluid and dynamic training. But the other issue was the way he carried his gun. It made it very hard for him to quickly deploy his firearm in the way that he was carrying it. Now, again, if I walk him up to a target and I call threat and he draws his gun, you would never notice it. Everything's fine. But when he's going from another skill set like palm strikes to quickly having to draw his gun based on reacting in real time without warning and have to hit the target that he's shooting at, now all of a sudden you see faltering. And now you can say, hey, we gotta analyze that. What's going on? Maybe that carry method's not the best for you, or maybe you just need to practice more on deploying from that carry method, or maybe the technique that you're trying to use to deploy that gun from that carry method is not working for you. But we got a problem, and now it's got to be fixed. And then in a structured way, you can work on that problem by isolating it fixing it, and then integrating it back into this fluid and dynamic setting. So those types of issues really only come out when you challenge people in ways that are closer to real combat. Because when you put people in a static training environments, they can look really good in training, but a lot of those things that they're doing aren't going to translate well to a real fight because they're missing other aspects that are also essential but are completely devoid from their preparation. So what are your thoughts about that, Lou?
Well, it's a key point that you're making here, and as an aside, before I go directly to answering that, you can remember the workshop that we did about defense in and around vehicles. It was a really interesting thing because we took students out, and it's raining like heck. We got them having to exit vehicles, deploy their handguns, deploy their other tools that they had, and it brought them into a world that they really weren't accustomed to. And it brings out all of these points that you're talking about how accessible is my handgun? Can I get to my knife rapidly where I've put it? Um, is the clothing that I'm wearing going to facilitate movement when I have to do it? All of these issues come up based on the way you're training. But now to add into what you're saying is that once we get finished or get through a fairly good amount of training to where the student really understands how they can go from one skill set to the other and do that pretty fluidly in controlled drills when we're using pads and things of that nature. They've sorted out where they're carrying their equipment. They found out what worked, what didn't work. We went back and correct some of the problems we had in the individual skill sets as far as their ability to perform. You brought up an example about accuracy and shooting. Well, then we would go back and work with the individual and develop a little more training for them that will allow them to become more accurate under more high stress environments. Once we accomplish that, then we have the next step of the integration process in which we're going to be bringing them into controlled force-on-force training environments. And what we mean by that is that we're going to take a more scenario-based format as opposed to an exact drill that they were doing where we tell them, okay, hit this pad, 10 times and then go for your weapon or something like that, or keep hitting the pad until you hear a whistle or whatever we use to then go ahead and draw your weapon. And then we're going to ramp that up where we're going to bring a role player in. We're going to do it three-dimensional with more real time involved in it. And we're going to allow them to start to see a real person launching a specific type attack on them. As an example, if it's a gun threat, we're going to arm that role player initially with a air gun or something, and maybe not even have them even break a shot, but have them standing across the person and let them see how it looks like when someone is bringing a handgun to bear on them, so that their mind starts to capture this visual picture of what that looks like. And the more they see that in training, it's making impressions in their subconscious every time they see it. And what we're trying to do in these controlled drills is get them to understand how this all looks when it's being launched towards them. How does it look from your mind's eye, in your eyes, or how does it look like when someone is coming at you with the knife? When we start that person maybe 10 feet away from you and all of a sudden they start moving towards you and they present that knife, how does it look? And in a controlled way, what we're trying to do is now ramp up the type of drilling we're doing to where that person will now start to develop through a visual way. How do things look like when they're really happening to me? How fast is that person going to be able to close that distance to me? At what point am I going to actually see that gun when he takes it from behind his back because he's hitting it, and all of a sudden you're looking down the barrel of it? The only way that you can learn this is you have to actually do it. You can read all the books you want. You can go look at all the videos you want. You can go shoot 1,000 rounds on the range every week, and that is not seeing this. That is doing something completely different. So In the first stage of this, we're going to be very controlled. We're going to develop very specific drills that will allow people to start to develop this mental imaging of what does it look like. And once we get the person through a certain amount of this type of training to where they're getting fluid with it, where they can see these things happening, and then integrate those skill sets, whether it's the shooting skills of moving offline, or if it's something where we started all very close to where you're more in contact distance with someone, where you may have to immediately go to your personal weapons first. All of this is going to be accomplished during that phase of training, so that that person really gets a good idea of how it all looks. Now, once we get to the person through that type of integrated training, then we have to look at a higher level of training to bring them to. And that is where we have to now start to bring additional stressors into the picture, and we have to start to allow them to do more of their own decision making. In other words, they're not going to necessarily know what type of attack is going to be launched against them. Sometimes it may be an unarmed attack on them, sometimes it may be a knife attack, sometimes it may be a gun assault, and sometimes it may be no assault at all, to where they're going to use verbal skills to be able to diffuse whatever's happened there. And we're going to add those stressors in, because now we have brought them into an arena where they have now lost control of one of the most key elements of all of this, and that's time. We're basically taking a lot of their reaction time to things away from them, and it accelerates their need to be able to immediately transition to whatever skill set has to be done to meet that specific threat. And this is a very, very crucial stage of training, because here's where we're starting to bring them as close as we can to the reality of actual physical confrontations.
Now, you know, the issue of training the eyes is so important. I want the viewers to think about this. When we talk about responding to a threat, the way that I like to break it up very simply, and I know it can be broken up more than this, but just a quick kind of synopsis of the big parts of what we're dealing with is recognition and response. And the more time you spend on recognition, the longer it takes to get to the response part. And when fights can turn on tenths of a second, and when it's our life that hangs in a balance, we need to be responding as quickly as possible. So we need to train our eyes as best we can to recognize what these threats look like, so that when we're seeing a threat in real response, we're spending less time on the recognition part, in other words, trying to figure out what's happening, so that we can more quickly get to the response part. And of course, the response part has pieces there too, right? We have to have the physical skills to execute a response. We have to have the personal ability to execute those physical skills. In other words, we have to have the right techniques and then the personal ability to effectively execute those techniques. But we also have to understand, you know, we have to have a game plan. In other words, I always say to students, you don't want to wait till you're in the problem to solve the problem, for a lot of different reasons. One, the intellectual brain is the problem solver, and the intellectual brain is suppressed by stress. So we don't want to wait till we're in the problem to be solving the problem. But the other thing is the intellectual brain is relatively slow and oftentimes can't keep up with what's happening in a violent situation because everything is happening so fast. So we want to have that plan in place before we need it, so when we end up in the situation, we already have a game plan on how we're going to respond to it. Now, we always have to be flexible, right? Just because we think of a plan ahead of time doesn't mean we're always going to execute that plan the way that we planned it. But just having a plan in place before we're in the actual problem is a critical part of getting us to that response quicker. So we always want to have that plan in place before we need it. You don't wait till you're in the problem to solve the problem, but we have to train our eyes to recognize the threat so we can more quickly get to the response. So training the eyes and that decision making is a really critical aspect of training that a lot of times I think gets overlooked. People spend all this time on physical development. Yeah, I can shoot that tight group. Yeah, I can hit that bag real heavy. But there's a big difference between doing that and going into force-on-force training, or going into the ring, as an example, if you're a boxer and sparring with somebody, or being in a real fight. And a lot of that is a recognition and response. That's where the force-on-force training comes from. And that's where you need that ability to respond in an integrated way, to integrate your skills based on what the circumstances are, to quickly recognize what you need to do and quickly get to that response and then respond in a way that's effective.
Well, I agree 100%. And, that's really probably the missing link in most people's training is that this isn't what's really done. This is where, we can take people who are very good shooters. You could take them out and challenge them to almost anything that you want to put out there. And as a shooter, they can solve the problem. But oftentimes, as a fighter, they'll never get to the solution because they've missed all of these cues that you can only really get via this type of training. And I can't stress enough for everybody listening to this, if you truly want to be able to say that you have the best chance of defending yourself, you really have to undergo this type of training. It is just not enough to go learn how to hit things. We can teach anybody to hit a heavy bag, a focus pad. You can teach most people to be fairly competent within given ranges with their handguns or shotguns or rifles. But where it's really at in training is this integration of all of this, because we don't fight in sterile environments. We don't really know that a fight is about to happen in almost all cases until it's actually happening. In many cases where we can forecast it, we're going to find other places to go. We're going to defuse a situation by vacating the area, things of that nature. But the places where you're going to get killed is in the spontaneous stuff. And the best way to learn how to deal with spontaneous incidents is to develop this type of integrated training. And if I can bring it to the next step that we have to go through is once we've taught people now how to forecast these things, meaning we've given them a good dose of visual skill development and decision-making ability. Now what we have to try to do to them is bring their physical stress level at a higher degree as they're entering into trying to do this problem solving. Meaning we're going to try to do things to them to get their heart rates elevated. We know the direct link from past training, from podcasts that we've done. We've discussed these issues about what the sympathetic nervous system does to our body, which is elevate your heart rate, which causes you motor skill problems. We talk about the visual things that happen to people under high stress, meaning they lose their peripheral vision. They may not see the world in the same way because of pupil dilation. Information is not getting processed in their brain in the same way due to their degraded physical condition at that point as far as what the sympathetic nervous system is doing. So in essence, what we want to try to do at a certain level of training is cause people to be under some physical duress and still be able to do the skills that they've been training. Because if you've never worked at a high heart rate on the range, how would you know how it feels? Even if you're doing competitive shooting, excuse me, that's still not the same as someone shooting at you. It's still not the same as someone pulling a gun on you and seeing it coming down range. It certainly isn't a close-quarter knife attack where someone's viciously trying to, carve your body apart. Your system, meaning your heart rate and all the elements of the sympathetic nervous system activation, are going to put you in a little bit different world than you are when you're in more control of what's going on in your environment. So when we've taken people to a certain level, we want to start to add these stressors in there. One of the ways that we used to do it is just put up a pad on a tree and let someone beat it with their baton for about 3 or 4 straight minutes. Now, it doesn't sound like much until you're beating on pad on a tree for 3 or 4 minutes and your heart rate starts going up and you're not in physical condition to really be able to handle that. But that's where you are when all of a sudden we say, enter the room and deal with whatever's in there. And then someone has to go into an environment that is completely out of their control and deal with whoever's there and whatever they're going to try to do to them based on the skill levels that they have and the tools that they have. You can see already that brings us into a whole nother realm of training. And if you're going to be able to operate in these higher stressed environments where you're no longer in control of a lot of the things that you would like to be in control of. It requires a high level of skill at that point. And when we talk about integrating skills, we have to make sure that we've done all the prerequisite work before we bring people here. So I guess what I'm driving at is two things that I would probably conclude on here, and that is that you can see that when you methodically do this type of skill integration, what you're continually doing is not only starting at a point of maybe little skill and building up skills, but you're constantly challenging those skills in a manner which ultimately is going to reflect the way that you're going to actually fight with it. While we both know that you cannot duplicate live combat in training, there's a lot of things that we can do, but there's some things you just can't do. But what we can do is get people comfortable to the point where, even though they may be confronted with a scenario that may at first glance be overwhelming, when they fall back on the training as opposed to going up in training at that point, but when they fall back and default to their level of training, that level of training will bring them close enough to be able to get them through whatever that they're dealing with in front of them. And I would probably add this one last bit of information in here, and that is that as part of your training in doing all these skill developments, I would strongly encourage everybody to add physical training into the mix, because the more physically fit you are, your body is going to have a little bit more better response to stresses. Meaning, if you take your heart rate up on a daily basis because you're physically exercising, your body starts to get used to operating at a higher degree of stress level. If it's power that you need to develop in your striking, well, a corollary way to develop that besides doing the movements is to do physical training that'll help develop those muscle groups that will help you develop the power that you might need to be effective. Because obviously, if whatever you're doing, let's say if it's a hand-to-hand fight where you're using palm strikes or whatever striking things that you're doing, if it doesn't have power enough to hurt the individual, how are you going to stop what they're doing? If it doesn't have power enough to either cause them to get the physical trauma that's needed to get them to redirect their attack on you or debilitate their ability, then it doesn't matter. So physical training is very important. Now that doesn't mean that you have to go spend 3 hours in the gym. We try to suggest for this type of fighting skill development anaerobic training as opposed to aerobic training, because fights generally don't last 5-minute bouts. They don't last, a sequence of a couple of minutes bout, rest time, a couple of minute bouts. These are very high expenditures of energy in very, very condensed time. This is anaerobic training. So what we would recommend that you do are things that require you to really exert yourself in a shorter period of time, but exert yourself more fully, as opposed to a very spread out way that you're doing your training. And it doesn't mean that you're training to be on the cover of Muscle and Fitness magazine. It doesn't mean that you got to go spend hundreds of dollars to go in a gym. We're talking about at times just body weight exercises. You can go on YouTube and find all kinds of great body weight exercises to do to help everything from your strength level to your flexibility. But what we're looking to do is develop a fighter. And here's where I think separates, I know what you do in your training programs, Ian, and I know obviously in the things that I personally do, is we have no desire to train a shooter. We have no desire to train a sport fighter. What we're doing is trying to train people to fight, to stay alive. And that's a whole different type of mentality when you go into doing that. And it's not to denigrate sport issues, sport shooting. It's not to denigrate sport martial arts. But we both know that what you're going to teach people in the realm of really staying alive when people are trying to kill them is not the type of things that you're teaching people to go into a tournament on a Saturday, in a particular martial art, or go necessarily uh, do things in a match that might not really replicate what happens to people in a live combat shoot. We want fighters at the end of our training, and this integrated training, to include integrating physical training into it, is going to be the way to go to develop that fighter.
And just to reiterate what you and I said many times in the past, we're both big fans of competition, both things like boxing or wrestling or judo or whatever, and also the shooting competitions, because they're really effective training tools because they help people deal with competition. Somebody trying to do to you what you're trying to do to them. Competition is phenomenal for that. And even if you don't compete in a formal way, using competitive training methods in training are just fantastic. So we're both big enthusiasts about that. But we always have to know specifically what are we training for when we talk about training for fights. So in other words, we might use competition as a very effective means of training, but we're always training for the fight. And of course, nothing in training, just like nothing in competition, is the same as a real fight. But we want to use those as tools to make us better in those areas that will help us fight better. And when we talk about the force-on-force training so much because it's critical for all these different things that we're talking about today and all of the other things that we talk about I always think about like a boxer. If you take a boxer and put him on a heavy bag and then you put him in a competition, well, there's going to be a real big gap between how he looks on the heavy bag and how he looks when he's in that competitive match. If you have him spar in the gym before he goes fights in a competition, well, there's still going to be a difference in how he looks competing than how he looks when he's sparring, because there's a different level of pressure there and a different level of intensity. But the gap is going to be a lot smaller than if he just goes right from the bag to the competition. And that's what we're looking for force-on-force training to be. We're not pretending it's a fight. It's not a fight. Nothing in training is real violence, because in training, nobody's trying to hurt you on purpose. And in a real fight, you don't even know if you're going to be breathing afterwards. So that gap's always going to be there. But we can use training to develop things that help us fight better, and the closer we come to reality, the better off we are, and I think that's really critical. And I just want to throw out one thing about the the conditioning. I always tell students, the better health we are, the better off we are. But also remember that no matter how good a shape or bad a shape you're in, when you're in the moment, you're not going to be self-aware, probably, because you're going to be hyper-focused on a threat. And regardless of how good a shape you're in or how bad a shape you're in, you're probably not going to be aware of how tired you are and what injuries you're sustaining and all that. But then when the fight's over and you become self-aware, when you become aware of where you are in your environment, when you become aware of your injuries, when you start to feel pain again, that's when you're going to feel like you're going to die from exhaustion. And that's going to happen regardless of how good a shape you're in or how bad a shape you're in. So I always tell students, fitness is a very important part of health, and health makes everything better. But if there are people that are listening to this where, they're like, well, I can't, do push-ups every day, or my schedule doesn't allow for that, or maybe they're just not motivated to do that, the heart of combat training is always going to be the mental aggression. And then any physical training that you do as far as conditioning is concerned, it's just going to help you execute that aggression. But don't be scared off of combat training by thinking, well, I don't have six-pack abs. That's okay. It would be great if you had six-pack abs. But what's more important is that aggression to say that I'm going to do whatever it takes to be the one breathing when that situation is over. And I know, Lou, you and I agree with this 100%. I just want to throw out a little bit of a counterbalance in case there's anybody getting scared off. Oh, man, I can't do those 100 push-ups a day. That's okay. Don't worry. Just want to value innocent life enough, whether it's your life or the life of another innocent person, that you're willing to do whatever it takes. God forbid someone's trying to hurt you and you're the innocent victim, then you make sure that you're their problem. Don't let them be your problem. You have that aggression that you take the fight to them and force them to react to you. And that right there is going to be the biggest difference in success and failure. Fitness is a very important way to help us be better, but it's not an essential part of being effective, in my humble opinion. Because the reality is most people that get in fights, they're not in good shape, but somebody still wins and somebody still loses. And that's almost going to always hinge on aggression. Lou, we're at about that hour mark. Would it be okay with you if we maybe wrapped up this topic of force skill integration, and then let's maybe go to answer our questions?
Yes, absolutely. We're ready to go here.
Okay, so is there anything you want to throw in specifically about the topic of force skill integration, or I know you gave a very good conclusion, but I just want to open up the door in case there's anything that you want to add now.
Oh, sure. Well, again, one of the things that we trying to get across in the presentation of this force skill integration is it's something we really would like everyone to do. It's something that you will reap a benefit from that you just can't get from doing regular just skill training and specific skill sets. Um, and we really encourage you to seek out this type of training because I think out of all the things that you can do, this type of training is going to get you to where you want to go in your overall desire to be more competent at defending yourself. This is a lifelong thing that we get involved in when we talk about um, skill set integration. We constantly practice all of these skill sets, and even if you don't have the ability to even have a training partner, we don't want to make anybody think that unless you're constantly doing this, that you're not able to do things to make you better. You can take any one of these skill sets that you want to become competent in and spend the amount of time that you feel you need to be able to get competent in that particular skill set. So if all you can do based on your schedule, during a normal work week is get in and spend 5-10 minutes hitting a heavy bag that you might have set up in your house, or even if you don't have that, just working through the mechanics of the movements in the air, this is all going to help you in the long run. And then when you get the opportunity to do specific training in this, I would say jump on it. But make sure that whoever you're dealing with actually knows what they're doing, because this is not, as a trainer, I can tell you this is not easy training to put on. It's very methodical. You have to be very cautious of how you're leading one thing into the other so that at the end you have a final product that is correct. Because if the process isn't done right, then obviously it's like most things, the end product is not going to be where you want it to be based on the training that you're doing. So I encourage everybody to seek out this type of training. It'll be very beneficial to you in the long run.
Great, Lou. Thank you so much. And we got a couple questions here, and I'm going to read the first one. It says, "Hi, Lou and Ian. Thank you for taking my question. In a previous podcast, you guys discussed integration of skill sets. If you guys had a brand new civilian student come to you with no background in fighting self-defense, what order of skill sets?" And then in parentheses, he has hand-to-hand, sharp weapons, impact weapons, handguns, non-lethal weapons, long guns. That ends the parentheses, and he finishes the sentence by saying, "Would you teach them so the integration comes as natural as possible?" And Lou, I'm just going to mention a couple things real quick here. I'm going to start answering his question, and then I'm going to throw it over to you. But I've got two classes that I'm teaching today, an unarmed combat class at the Royal Oak campus of Oakland Community College. This is actually their very first day of physical skills. I'm looking forward to that. And then after that, I'm teaching at Chippewa Valley Schools a 2-hour unarmed combat class also. And if anybody's seen this live and you want to go look on our schedule, you'll see those classes there. But anyways, I'm going to have to leave here in about 20 minutes, so maybe just about 5 minutes per question. I'm sorry to put a limit like that on it, guys, but I'm fighting the clock here. But I would very briefly answer his question by saying that when I do this personally, I basically take the students where they're at. So somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I want to learn how to use a handgun for self-defense," and that might be the very first self-defense related skill that they learn, then that's fine. Then I'll teach them the handgun skills that they want, but I'll also encourage them that they should learn unarmed combat, and I'm a big fan of sharp weapons. And by sharp weapons, I don't mean knives, although all the concepts apply to knives. I'm talking about something simple like a pen that you can take with you wherever you go, even court buildings and airplanes. And God forbid you have to defend yourself, assuming that level of force is justified. You have a very effective tool that you can quickly deploy. And unlike a lot of other weapons, I can actually walk out to my car with this in my hand, and people will not even necessarily associate it as a weapon. And the quickest thing you're going to deploy is what's in your hands. So that's what I would do, Lou. I would take them where they come. and then I would then kind of round out their skill sets based on their starting point, and then add what I think is most critical based on what they haven't gotten yet.
And I completely agree. It all has to start somewhere, and everybody, based on their background, their desires, is going to have a particular skill that they want to try to develop first. The issues that we talked about is it's not necessarily what skill you're going to start first with. You can't get to integration until you have a couple of skills built anyways. So whether you start with unarmed combat, or start with firearms, or start with sharp weapons, it really is insignificant to the process of integration, because you can't really integrate until you have at least two of those things present. So wherever the student wants to start, that's where I would begin. The neat thing about, frankly, training with Ian, or if you're training with me, regardless of where you start, what you're going to be doing is starting a process that is already designed to integrate with the other things that you're going to do. In other words, you're not going to get disjointed training. If you're being taught unarmed combat, you're not going to be being taught one thing there, and then when we switch over, let's say you want to stop firearms training, well, the principles we talk about are going to be very similar, except instead of using one tool, you're going to be using the other. And we do, of course, the specific things in each one of them that you have to do to develop the skill. But when it comes to integration on it, it wouldn't matter which one you started with, because when we start to piece it together, it'll start making sense, because it all follows the same logical path.
Great, Lou. Thanks so much. And that was from one of my private lesson students. And he was actually referred to me by Joe Ferreira, who is near and dear to our heart, and one of our fellow trainers. Another man that I would call teacher. I know he's one of your contemporaries. You both trained with Rex Applegate as an example, and you're both leading proponents for combat point shooting, the target focus shooting. And I'm blessed to have the ability to mentor under both of you. So. But James is a really good student, and I'm glad to thank you very much for your question, and for being someone that is so dedicated to training, and someone that I really enjoy working with. And I'm looking at my questions here. The very next question that we have is from Mark Levis. Now, Mark Levis is also a good friend of mine. Way back from 2000, we got involved in a group called the Michigan Coalition for Responsible Gun Owners. I started off as the Wayne County chair for training, and also for law enforcement and judicial relations. And not too long after that, they made me their state director of education. And Lou, that's when we eventually brought you to Michigan, doing a fundraising event for them. And that's when you and I first got a chance to work together on a professional level, although I was lucky enough to train with you prior to that. And so Mark's question is, and by the way, he was a former Marine, Lou, so one of your brothers in arms. His question is, I always look at conveying the need of defensive mindset to include zones or rings around you. I think most training focuses on the firearm, and the misconception that you will be able to draw it when needed. In a sudden violent encounter, you may need to fight, grapple first to gain the time and distance necessary to be able to produce your firearm. What training would you suggest to prepare one for these types of encounters? How should one prepare mentally as well? One should expect to have a few blows taken, as well as possible of injury. I believe I read that correctly. The saying, your handgun is used to get to your long gun. One should think your hands and feet are used to fight back, or fight your way back to the handgun as well. In other words, your unarmed combat skills open up the opportunity for you to deploy a weapon. In this case, he's talking about a handgun. Of course, one should always keep a reactionary gap of at least 2 arms lengths around them. And we talked a lot about these issues, and of course, we'll expand upon them. And Mark, thank you very much for your question. Mark's a personal friend of mine. His dad passed away not too long ago, and he was a wonderful man, and someone that I had a great deal of respect for. And Mark also, who's one of my students, and I believe somebody that's trained with you as well, Lou. And I would say always that when we talk about distance, I don't like to think about distance in terms of numbers, because people don't relate to distance that way. It's more of an impression of what they're able to do under the circumstances that they're in, and a lot of that is training the eyes and judgment. So you put people into different situations where they have to spontaneously react depending on where they are. So as an example, somebody draws a gun on me, and my job, number one, is to get out of their line of fire. Number two, to get them in front of my line of fire. Now, that might be by grabbing the gun and pushing it away from my body, or it might be by rapidly moving my feet to get off their line of fire. There's not a set distance that says at one distance I'll do this, at another distance I'll do that. It really is just a reaction for me as an individual, and in the individual circumstances that I am, I'm going to have to make a spontaneous judgment. What is going to get me out of their line of fire quickest? What is going to get them in front of my line of fire the quickest? What are your thoughts on that, Lou?
Well, hey, Mark, great question, and glad hearing from you. Ian's covered a lot of the points, so I don't want to backtrack on that. But something I would add here that I think might make sense to everyone listening is that when we talk about the way we really operate in the real world, having this concept of distance sometimes can get very distorted. So if we try to teach people something as a 2-yard technique or a 3-yard technique or a 5-yard technique, when we see a lot of the effects of the sympathetic nervous system, we find that one of the things that goes very rapidly is our ability to judge where we are in space, meaning that we have a hard time judging distance. So what we try to do is, in the course of training, is to get people through the repetition of doing different drills to get this mental picture of what things look like in front of them, so that they intuitively, based on what's been imprinted in their subconscious, know what will be the appropriate response. As an example, if I've got someone that is within, let's say, less than arm's reach from me, well, it would be probably very foolish for me to teach someone to use a kicking technique as a means of defense at that range. So we would want them to intuitively learn this by bringing people in front of them, by using the pad drills, and then ultimately having a sparring partner, if you will, in a role player, so that they get used to understanding what is a proper distance to use an elbow, what's a proper distance to use a palm strike, a kick, all of this. And if we turn to firearms, what is the appropriate position if we're drawing that weapon to bring it out in the first place? Is it going to be drawing to eye-level shooting, close-quartered positions, extremely close-quartered positions? The only way that we can really understand this is that you have to get in this environment with another body in front of you. And you have to just go through the repetition of seeing this rapidly develop. And one of the other reasons why we don't like to necessarily teach, techniques based on distance, but on your ability to determine where you are in relation to that person as to what particular response you're going to do, is that people can close distance on you very quickly. Someone might be at 5 yards away from you when you see their edge weapon. Well, we have the reaction time, we have the movement time to get to your weapon, and when we sum total those two, we have what we call response time. So if I taught you just specifically every time something is at 5 yards, you got plenty of room there to be able to draw your gun out and shoot it from a particular position. Well, when that person aggressively comes at me and closes that distance within 1 second, and they've got that knife sitting on my throat, this isn't going to pan out as far as a distance technique. So what we have to do to get people to understand what's appropriate is you have to put them in environments to determine that. So when they're trying to apply skills that they've learned, also understand where the appropriate place to use those skills are. Hopefully that makes sense.
Great, Lou. Thank you, sir. And the next question we have is from Corey Bishop. Corey Bishop is actually started with me at the college, Royal Oak campus, where I teach at Oakland Community College, where I'm going to be leaving here for shortly. And Corey's a fantastic student, and he's also a longtime martial artist, and he actually trains with a martial artist that I've known for many years as a personal friend of mine, and runs a wonderful program. And Corey, thank you very much for your question. And his question is, What would be the most effective way of protecting oneself from unarmed attackers? Several unarmed attackers. That was the question. Several unarmed attackers. What level of force will be necessary, and what level of force will be legal? Now, again, I'm going to kind of take the lead here, Lou, and then end with your input. There are no blank checks. We always have to respond to each individual circumstance based on what's called the totality of the circumstances, and we have to respond in a way that's reasonable to those circumstances. Now, generally speaking, if you're dealing with multiple threats, that can represent an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, which would then authorize the use for lethal force, but that really does depend on the totality of the circumstances. Again, that's not a blank check. If you look at the concept of a multiple attackers as a lethal threat, then of course that would authorize lethal force, if that was factually correct or true. Then of course lethal force would be justified, and then how you deploy that lethal force would depend on what your options were. Now, again, when you talk about fighting, you can never say never or always say always. You always have to respond to the individual circumstances, and it's a little bit of a big topic to discuss here kind of in this format. But what I would say is when you're dealing with threats, you always want to kind of try to stay outside the storm, and you want to use a principle called shielding. So in other words, you know, a lot of times you'll hear people say, shoot this target one time, shoot this target two times. Well, that's really not how things work in a dynamic situation. What I always try to recommend people do is you stay outside the circle of flesh, because if you end up in the circle of flesh, you can very quickly get overwhelmed from multiple directions. Stay outside the circle of flesh so that you're hopefully using one person as a barricade between you and the other people, which then slows down their ability to deploy force on you, which gives you more time to react to what's going on. But that's not 100%. I was in a fight one time where I had one guy pressed into another guy, pressed into a corner. And I was hitting one guy and then hitting the other guy and then hitting the other guy and then just kind of going back and forth like that. And you know, how can you even teach a concept like that? Because when is that going to come up, right? But it just so happened they were in the corner of a room, and I backed one right into the other one, and then they were stuck there, and I was able to do the things that I had to do. But generally speaking, you want to stay outside the mass, outside the storm, and you want to use a principle called shielding. The level of force will always depend on the individual circumstances that you're facing. Lethal force is only justified when there's a lethal threat, but multiple attackers can be an indicator of a lethal threat. Lou, what are your thoughts?
Well, you've covered a lot of it, and I would say up front, it's a complex issue that has so many different ways of having to deal with it. So what I'll try to do is focus on a couple of quick points. One point is that no matter what your skill level is in unarmed combat, if you're standing in the middle of multiple threats, you're going to probably be in real trouble real quick. Meaning, you cannot stand in the middle of a triangle when you got multiple people in multiple directions of attacking you and last too long standing there. Eventually, they're going to get their hands on you. And if they get their hands on you, first thing that's going to happen is you're going to go to the ground. And that's just the way these fights work. So as a concept, what we try to do is, one, you got to be real mobile. You can't stand still, because if you stand still, they're targeting you while you're standing still. So we teach a principle of going to the outside edges of wherever these threats are and deal with the outside edge first. And these things of shielding and all you're talking about opens up a door to give you those few moments that you need to inflict trauma to whoever you're dealing with first. But this goes back to some of the concepts we talked about earlier. If you're hitting and you're not hurting them, then you're not stopping. So whatever you're doing to whoever you're fighting has to be very rapid. It's got to be very destructive, because you're not going to have too much time there. The other thing that you might think of doing is, if it is at all possible, break contact. And if you're going to fight on a more even playing field, if you will, if that option's available. Now, I don't want, there's certain things I really don't want to say because we worry about legality issues, but frankly, multiple threats against you is a lethal threat. Because if you got more than one person attacking you, why does more than one person attack you? When we talk about the infliction of grave bodily harm, when we talk about the threat of grave bodily harm, I would think that we could probably agree that 3 adults beating the hell out of you is probably doing a pretty significant amount of damage to you. So what we find that happens is in a lot of these multiple threat scenarios, um, there's a lot of damage done to the one person that is getting beat. So we can only take this so far in this format, but what we would recommend is not standing in the middle, finding the best target of opportunity you have at the edges, and if you're ever going to fight like a complete animal, that's when you're going to fight as a complete animal. You have to bring yourself in a realm of fighting where most people have never been, even if they've been in a lot of one-on-one contacts, because you have very significant threat there when there's more than one person. We're not even talking about initially it may be an unarmed combat scenario that might rapidly get into an edge weapon fight. It might rapidly get into a impact weapon fight, that they pick up weapon of opportunity, all of these things. But that's probably as far as I'd want to take it there for a number of reasons.
Yeah, and there's so much to say about this issue. I mean, the other thing we talk about is when people start losing, if they have the ability, they start escalating. So how often you see people get into a fist fight because maybe they think they can win it, all of a sudden they don't win it, and now they've got a weapon on them, and now they're going to escalate to the use of that weapon. So that threat goes up even more so when you're dealing with multiple threats. Maybe they didn't introduce a weapon into their assault on you because they didn't think they needed it. They had you outnumbered. But, man, if they start losing, if they got that weapon, you better believe that they're probably going to deploy it. So it makes it even more critical that you either break contact or shut them down as quickly as possible. And the other thing I'll briefly say about this is the issue of aggression. Our use of force always has to be in proportion to the threat, but we always want to cause maximum injury that's justified under the circumstances as quickly as possible, because when you're dealing with a group, what you're dealing with is, people have that anonymity of being a part of a group. And what they're trying to do is hurt you without getting hurt in the process. That's why they're there. Otherwise, they'd be fighting you one-on-one. So you got to break that anonymity by making them in fear for their individual safety. And the way you do that is when they see somebody getting hurt bad, and they understand that can happen to them too, that's where you usually get a lot of the hesitation. And when the mind hesitates, the body hesitates, and that's your window of opportunity. And I know this almost sounds stupid, and I hope it doesn't sound stupid, but having been in a lot of fights with more than one person, and I know this is going to sound dumb, Lou, and you can make fun of me if you want to, but almost feel like, at least from my personal encounters, that they were actually easier dealing with multiple people than it was one person, because with multiple people, you got a lot of people standing around hesitating, waiting for their opportunity to hurt you without getting hurt. And if you start to rip into them very aggressively, it's almost like they're just standing there not knowing what to do. Now, I know not every encounter is like that, but that was my own personal experiences when I've been in these situations. One person is really focused on you. More than one person, they're kind of standing around waiting for their free shot, not really wanting to get in the mix where they might get hurt too.
I agree, and I've been in that exact scenario, and that's what I was trying to allude to about the aggression of the fight. People don't like to fight anybody that they think is basically going to be very difficult to deal with. Once you turn on the aggression, it becomes a little bit more shocking for them to continue their fight, particularly if you're hurting them in the process of fighting. So, there's a lot of things that we could talk about here, but to tie it in as a last comment with the integrated training, if you want to find out how it feels like, the only way you can feel this is you got to get in there with 2 or 3 people and see how it feels.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to really feel how this would all integrate, this would be a point where you could push into. We do this with some of the firearms training portion about 2-on-1 fighting and 1-against-2 fighting with the air guns, and it blows most of the training that people get and how to deal with these issues right out the window. Once you throw them in the ring where now I put 2 people against 1 or 1 against 2, they find that a lot of the things that they thought were going to work just don't work anymore. So to leave it on that point, I would say the best way you can feel this is integrated training. And if you want to get a perspective of it, other than getting in a live fight with multiple people, you're going to have to just get in there with several people and find out what happens.
Yeah, and the last thing I would say again is the aggression. You know, people are real tough when they're not getting injured, but when they're being injured in significant ways, I mean serious ways, you know, the toughest folks in the world all of a sudden aren't so tough anymore. And I don't care how tough somebody acts, if they're breathing, it's because they want to be. So everybody has this sense of self preservation. And when people are getting seriously injured, all of a sudden that's not what they signed up for. So the quicker you get to causing those serious injuries, the better off you are. Again, always bring it back to the context, what's justified under the circumstances. It's only the use of force, at least here in Michigan, if it's used to stop an imminent threat to an innocent person and when the level of force is in proportion to the threat being stopped. So all of those things put into play, whatever is justified, you want to be right there maxing out your ability to shut them down by causing as much injury as you quickly can. That's justified. Now, last question here, and then I'm going to run out the door to get to my self-defense class. And this is from Melissa Buat, and she gave us questions last time. We all love Melissa, Lou. She's trained with you. I've actually known her all the way back since the late 80s when I first started training, right when I was still getting out of the boys' home. It was probably Ward of the State. So I've known her forever. And her dad was also one of the few men that I call teacher, Tador Buat. I trained with him for 11 years on a weekly basis, right there in his basement in the system of Balintawak, and I'm very blessed to have benefited from his knowledge and him teaching me. But her question is, what is the best weapon that I can carry as a backup to my gun? If I can't carry my gun on me due to clothing, what would be a good backup, like a taser, knife, whatever? Well, again, there's a lot that can be said about that. I'm going to briefly take the lead and then hand it over to you, Lou. And I would say a flashlight, a handheld flashlight is a great tool because it's a utilitarian tool. You know, you're going to need light a lot more than you're going to need to stop someone from hurting you. But my number one preference as a secondary weapon is, like I've already said, a pen, used as a sharp weapon, because the sheer amount of trauma that you can cause with this in a short period of time is simply devastating. And as long as that level of force is justified, both people in the public, in the private sector, and people in law enforcement, many documented cases of folks that are saving their lives. And unlike a lot of other weapons, this is something that you can take with you wherever you go, and this is even something with you that you can walk in your hand if you're going out to your car or somebody approaches you and you're concerned, and most people aren't going to associate it as a weapon. And the quickest weapon you can deploy is a weapon that's already in your hand. So I'm a big fan of the pen. But Lou, I'm gonna throw it to you to sum it up, and then we'll do our conclusion, and thank all the viewers for watching this and all the viewers that are going to watch this in the future as a recorded session.
Sure. Well, I think you hit on two tools that I know we've worked on in different workshops. One is a flashlight. Just a great impact weapon when we've learned how to use strikes such as hammer fist, put a flashlight in someone's hand, and they have a bezel that they can use as an impact weapon. Keeps a lot of trauma off your own hand. Many ways that you can use that flashlight in a defensive way. Highly recommend it because it's something that it's legal to have on you. It's something readily available and very easy to deploy. And I have to agree with you 100% about the sharp weapon being the pen, because that now gives you another type of level of force that you can use that, you know, it might not be the same as slashing with a edge weapon such as an expanding knife or a fixed blade knife, or sticking with it. But when properly trained, that can be an incredible tool in a close-quartered fight that starts that process of trauma to the other person to cause them to worry more about their own safety than about trying to destroy yours. So those are two really good things that you can carry virtually anywhere, anytime, and not have to worry about legalities of it. And those are two that I know, because we've talked about this before as far as all of these weapons. Those would be great choices, and I 100% concur with you.
Yeah, in any place that you carry them, go into your integrated training and make sure that you can deploy them based on how you carry them. And that's a matter of your technique and your carry method. There's a few things that go into that you want to sort out in training so that they will be a functional option for you in a real situation, not just enough to have them with you. And say that that's it. You got to be able to actually to deploy them. Lou, thank you so much for being a part of this Google Hangout. This is our second one that we've done as a companion to the podcast, and this particular Google Hangout was a companion to podcast number 3, which is integrated training. If people would like to listen to that podcast, they can go out to our website, livesafeacademy.com/podcast, and they will see there all of the podcasts that we've released for public consumption, and we would love for them to listen to them, to benefit from them, and to share them. We would also love for people to share this Google Hangout. We hope that you found it beneficial. And Lou, I can't say enough how much it means to me to have an opportunity to bring you out here and share your knowledge with the public and all the people that are watching these Google Hangouts and listening to these podcasts. And if folks would like to learn more about Lou, please visit his website at gunfighterslimited.com. If you'd like to learn more about Live Safe Academy, please visit us at livesafeacademy.com. And it's not too late to ask questions. If you post them out there, our next Google Hangout will answer them. And we really appreciate getting your feedback. Anything we can do to help educate people, we are honored for that opportunity. And Lou, thank you so much, and you have a great day, and it's been an honor, sir.
You too, Ian. Thanks for having me, and have great classes coming up.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, listeners, thank you, viewers. Have a wonderful day. You guys be safe.